All right, everybody, welcome back. It's the end of the world. Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu. And today we are talking about another of my favorite works of art of all time. That's right. It's the 1995 horror / psychological / unclassifiable genre film, Safe, directed by Todd Haynes. And it's awesome. Like, I watched it again.
Second feature film, huh?
Was that second feature? Yeah,
he knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, he did a bunch of shorts in the 80s. I mean, he's really he's like a guy who really developed his craft, like starting in college and kind of over time before just plunging into like an immediate feature.
You discovered Julianne Moore?
I don't know if he discovered her, but this is
her first lead role.
This is one of her earliest feature starring roles, yeah, for sure, and she's amazing. But before we get drawn into the wonderful, confusing, question-asking film, we thought we should probably talk about the whole Trump-Zelensky Ukraine White Oval Office meeting, which one of the more surreal things that I've seen in politics.
What's your take here? Was this deliberate by
100%
or deliberate by Trump Vance, or both, but then it kind of got crossed? That's what I sort of think.
Go on, elaborate on that.
Why were they talking in so much detail in front of the cameras in the first place for so long? That's my first question.
I think they hate him.
But that's not normal from either side, right? When these Oval Office things happen,
it's supposed to be very perfunctory and kind of.
They don't usually sit for like 50 minutes.
Yeah,
chatting.
Doesn't usually end with the guest being expelled from the White House by security.
Right. I'm saying like to start though, it's like it was already abnormal. I'm pretty sure.
For sure. It was a shame session, right? They wanted to publicly shame him.
But I think he
knew that,
and I think he sort of thought that he could come out okay, that there was an opportunity to like get his point of view across to the rest of the world, maybe.
Sure, but I mean, he's at a distinct disadvantage in that he like doesn't speak English that well.
No,
right?
It was pretty. Whatever your thoughts are on Ukraine, and we'll do an episode, I'm sure, at some point, but like it was just incredibly like weird to put this guy into this spot. And like,
well, after feigning that it's about this quote unquote $500 billion minerals deal.
Yeah. So that deal
is not happening, apparently. I mean,
we don't want that $500 billion anymore.
Well, I mean, it's unclear if there even are $500 billion worth of minerals in Ukraine. Like, the whole thing is very nebulous. And It's all predicated on this odd idea that American aid has to be a direct quid pro quo. Like, as if we've given you X amount of dollars, which is nowhere near 500 billion, by the way. It's 150, 200 billion, something. It's a lot of money, but it's nowhere near what this deal was demanding as recompense. Mm-hmm. It's almost like Trump's like, what's our return on this investment? When, like, as we were discussing last time, like, it's stupid to look at this as like a one-to-one, whatever you think about our empire being involved in Ukraine and antagonizing Russia, whatever, like.
But isn't that basically the whole game, right? I mean, we did see a couple of Republicans break on this, right? I think Murkowski was one of them.
Yeah.
But like, generally speaking, what is happening with all of the people who are in the bag for Trump, seemingly no matter what, is that almost the stupider and more destabilizing and more basically pointless at best and totally incorrect play at worst that Trump pulls off, the more they seem to think that he's this like brilliant 3D chess playing like chaos agent.
Yeah, it's really like, I guess the other big story that we're going to cover this week is the tariffs, which are apparently back. Oh, before we get to that, just one last thing on Ukraine. Apparently, as of tonight, we're recording this on Monday, the 3rd of March, 2025. Trump has canceled all military support for Ukraine. Like,
yeah,
it's over. And, I've listened to a lot and read a lot about this. It's not as if the U.S. was just sending money to Ukraine. That's like not how this works. What the U.S. was primarily doing was sending old weapons and tanks and things that like we weren't going to use anyway, right? So it's not like
got these hanging around. Why don't you take them off our hands?
Yeah, I mean, otherwise they're just going to go to the like police force in like San Bernardino or whatever. I mean, it's like, does the San Bernardino PD really need another Abrams tank? We already have 3, right? I mean, it's like,
yeah, right.
But all of that is just shut off. And a couple Republicans in the Senate have said, Putin's actually a bad guy. Like, and again, whatever you think of all this Russia stuff, I'm obviously very sick of like the lib, like Putin is a puppet master of Trump thing. It's like, whatever. I don't care. We talk about like,
what do you think is the fallout from this though?
Well, it seems really bad, right? I mean, it seems like Ukraine is going to have to get all of its aid from Europe now. And, it
also just seems again, like kind of going back to the USAID stuff and all of this, it's like, it just seems to only diminish American power and influence, which again, like, I'm not even saying it's necessarily like
a bad
something
thing. Yeah.
I'm not happy about, but like, it's this, again, whenever Trump seems to be in charge, it is this very weird dynamic of like isolationism where I don't want to come out in full-throated defense of the American imperial project.
No.
But I also don't understand why.
Well, if your stated goal like Trump, if your stated goal is to renew American imperial power, right? I mean, we talked a lot about all of his territorial ambitions for this expanded America, Canada, Greenland, etc. This seems a really backwards way of doing it. It's like,
right.
It doesn't make sense. But, God bless. But then back, setting aside Ukraine for the moment, like, and eventually we will have to come back and do a bit of a deeper dive on this topic. We've been avoiding it for too long. The tariffs on Canada and Mexico go into effect tomorrow morning.
I mean, we've been here before, and then there was a pause, so we'll see.
Right. But I mean, as of tonight, he did an interview where he said, all systems go,
Yeah.
Like, ground control to Major Tom, commencing countdown, tariffs on, right? I mean, it's...
yeah, it's just, I guess it's just like everyone on the continent who has been feeling like they're paying too much for stuff.
We need to pay more. We need to pay.
We should all just pay more. That'll get to the bottom.
Well, I mean, you sent me this CNN article which shows that most of our imported produce in the United States comes from Mexico.
Oh yeah, this is the quote from the article. I really loved it. The two countries supply a significant share, that's Canada and Mexico, of several key food categories to the United States. For example, Mexico is the largest supplier of fruit and vegetables to the U.S., while Canada leads in exports of grain, livestock, meats, poultry, and more. And it's like, oh, just fruit, vegetables, grain, livestock, and meats? Poultry? What's the problem then? Do you mean every single thing I've ever eaten in my life? Is that what you're... Oh, okay, I get it. Let's see.
And one of his big campaign promises was to bring down the price of groceries, right? And he's enacting a policy that seems...
Oh, it's not just that. It was that all of that would go away immediately, day one.
Which didn't happen.
The only reason that prices are high, because he's not in charge. And as soon as he's in charge, all prices will go lower. And then now he's charging 25% on fucking Canadian beef. And then Canada's now saying
we're going to shut off the power grid. We're cutting America off. Ontario.
Yeah, right? Ontario's
right. So we're not getting all that good Niagara Falls power that we used to. Or maybe we're only getting half of it now. Or I don't know how that's going to work.
Throughout most of my life following American politics and foreign policy decisions, I can at least see where the evil is trying to go, if that makes sense. I can at least be like, oh yeah, I'm sitting here in college and they're telling me that there's WMD, but there's no WMD. Oh, I wonder why they're doing that. Oh, right. Because they want to do that. Right.
Yeah.
Whereas this, I just like, I don't understand what the play is that I'm supposed to be upset about, like America doing. Do you see what I'm saying? Like,
Absolutely.
I know it. I don't know what is supposed to be achieved by this. Like, what do you think?
I think this is all just a consequence of what happens when you put like the stupidest people imaginable who have the most bigoted and contrarian points of view for venal and personal reasons.
Is too that like these people are basically like, if we just like take out our dicks and like push, right? That we are so powerful and so great and so important that our next deals will be so great because they will like everyone will come crawling back and realize that they can't compete with the might of American power. Is that?
I guess so. Yeah, I think so. And I don't,
because even Trump is like, yeah, there's going to be some pain.
There's going to be pain,
which is like, you know, I'm actually kind of surprised that he said that.
I mean, I didn't vote for Trump, but I mean, I'm sure all the people that did not sign up for pain. That was probably not
because they originally this was just going to instantly create so much money that we wouldn't even know what to do with all the money.
Right.
And now, like, even
but you got to keep in mind, he's also saved like almost no money by firing everyone in the federal workforce, right?
And they just every day we wake up and they've just taken more money off of the amount that they've apparently saved. To like realize.
It turns out like accounting is not one of the
they're like, oh no, that was 8,000, not 8 gazillion trillion. Our bad.
Oh wait, that contract ran out in 2015. Actually, our canceling it saves nothing.
It is like, and we'll talk about this more next week and at the end of this podcast.
Yeah,
like, we have entered this weird phase of just the stupidest people in the country being considered like the greatest geniuses of our time.
Yeah, we're in a state of what I like to call maximum idiocy, right? It's just the more idiotic, the better. All right, on to the movie.
But don't worry, as long as you don't need any fruit, vegetables, grain, livestock, meat, poultry, or electricity, everything is going to be fine.
Absolutely. And in a weird way, that kind of ties in with some of the themes of this movie, right? So you've never seen this before this week, right, Michael? It's a movie that I've been teaching. My friend Catherine Ang, who listens to podcasts sometimes, introduced it to me when we were staying together with her partner Evan over COVID. Mm-hmm. And like me, she's interested in scholarship of the environment and romanticism and these themes that we've touched on from time to time in the show. And this movie like sort of perfectly aligns with those interests, because this is a movie that's about a woman, Carol White, played by Julianne Moore, who's a housewife in late 80s, 1987, in the San Fernando Valley, so LA area. And she's living a seemingly perfect life, right? She has a beautiful, extremely opulent home. She has a full-time maid, Fulvia, who seems to take care of all of her domestic work. She's got a rich husband. Their sex life is bad, but that's the case for many people. This is a sacrifice that some people have to make. She has a ready-made son, right? He has a son from a previous relationship, Rory, who we'll talk about in a minute, who's my favorite character in the movie, probably.
Unbelievable.
And so she doesn't. It's not like she's being pressured to have kids or anything like that. Is why I mentioned that. And despite all of this, she has a circle of friends. She works out. She, is the big crisis of the first third of the movie is like the new couch, right? She's getting this new sectional couch. Yeah. That's delivered by Hank from Breaking Bad, Dean Norris, in one of his early roles.
But it is very of the era, right? We're talking about sort of pre-internet.
Yep.
Right. That the ennui that, was being described was exactly this, like big house, cookie cutter life, and go to the gym, right? But like, don't feel good about yourself. That all of that gets presented pretty quickly up top.
Yep. I mean, we very soon realize that despite all the wealth and material comforts of Carol's life, she's fundamentally empty and unhappy. That all of her relationships, including that with her husband and stepson, including that with all of her friends, and eventually with the medical professionals she consults as she starts to have problems with sickness, are she's miles away from everyone, right? Now, one of the things I love about this movie is, and it's a little bit annoying to talk about this in an audio medium, but I would encourage everyone to watch the movie. Even our summary of the plot is not going to spoil anything because very little actually happens in the picture. No. But what makes the movie so amazing is the filmmaking. I mean, like the cinematography, the sort of sound palette, the score combined with various other choices, and the tableau-like way that the camera treats its subjects. So many of the film's shots are these like incredibly static, long shots of her, Carol, walking in these very, very immaculate like houses, her house, the houses of her friends, her shopping, her going to aerobics, her at the, and it's like the camera just holds and things kind of transpire in this way that's almost like you're looking at a painting in various ways.
And she's quiet for so much of the movie.
I mean, this is a master performance by Julianne Moore.
Yes.
Julianne Moore is not...
It is like, again, like part of what I liked right at the beginning and through the whole movie is kind of like thinking about this very squarely as a piece of the late 80s, early 90s, right? That I don't know what happened as online life took over, but there's a sort of emptiness and silence here that I think the late 90s filled with the early enthusiasm of the internet.
That's right.
And we have subsequently put all of our sort of meaning of life and discourse and interactivity online. And this captured a moment where...
Just before that. I mean, the film's 95. I think 96 for me is the year of when mass adoption of the internet didn't reach peak, by any means, but really commenced. That was when people started having AOL in their homes.
Yep.
Being able to look at websites from, a dial-up modem. And so certainly when I was on the internet a little earlier than that, but we've talked about this before, it's a little more primitive, non-graphical interface, like text-based. It was only for pure nerds back then. Yeah. And this is right before that. The film's made in 95. It's set 8 years earlier. So it's made from the so-called end of history, mid-90s, Soviets are defeated. And that doesn't really, the sort of global picture doesn't enter into the picture to the movie so much. But 87 is like right before that happens, right? It's like this kind of high point of late Cold War, right? Like the very last moment.
Reagan's still in office.
Big Reagan energy, big yuppie energy, big American Psycho is kind of tapping into some of that same like era. With
But also kind of like that's lurking in the movie is that the promises of America in the 80s have come up empty and people are getting tired.
And filled with overwhelming dread.
Yeah, and I love like the all. There's so many little touches in the movie.
Yeah,
it's so brilliant. Like we'll get to it, but like one of the themes, let's say, of when she takes down that like notice, and it's like, are you exhausted by the 20th century?
Yeah, isn't that perfect? Like, what's the other line? Are you overwhelmed by fumes? Right?
Yeah. Well, because it is like. That is also of the time. There was a certain type of environmental paranoia that wasn't too far away from like fluoride in the water, I feel.
Yeah.
That it was all sort of a piece that, like, you've talked about this before, of the relative conservatism of environmentalist hippie.
Well, of certain aspects of it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And this kind of like idea of the business and corporate age of the 80s has like poisoned physical surroundings that people exist in, right?
Yeah, and I mean that is also literally true, right? I mean,
but also like there's also like the dialogue, the little like the emptiness,
the scraps of overheard dialogue,
hilarity. Like when they're in the locker room and the woman's explaining how, oh, the 12 steps, that program is it's just another form of addiction.
Yeah, I just love that. It's like, okay, yes, but it's an addiction that's not like gonna fucking kill you. Like, might we not mention that like as well? Yeah, that's another thing about this movie that's so good is all the little bits of overheard media that enter into our, like, there is a score that comes up from time to time, but a lot of the sound that you encounter in the film is diegetic. It's just like a radio that's playing in her car. It's people chatting in the back of the locker room. It's a TV. She falls asleep. She wakes up. A show's on the TV, right? That kind of thing. And it's all pointing us towards these various ways that life is being poisoned. Now, whether it's by chemicals, which becomes the main theme of the second and third parts of the movie,
right,
but also just all this ideological talk. When she first gets sick on the fumes, she's driving in her car, and there's a big truck that's just spewing, exhaust directly at her car, and she's got her window open, and she starts coughing, and then the coughing gradually builds. And many people have pointed out, but really this is a horror movie, right? And instead of there being some Frankensteinian monster or Dracula, the enemy, the monster, is just like the entire environment. Right? Yeah. Like, where everywhere she goes, she encounters chemicals. And one of the things that I often talk about, because I've taught this movie a lot, and one of the things the students have questions about is like, is she actually sick because of chemicals, or is it all in her head? And the movie does not give us an answer to this question. It is. I was looking on Reddit at some of the discussions about this on film Reddit. People were like, yeah, like, I think she's actually just and I'm just like, it doesn't matter. That's not the point. It's not a mystery box. We're not like trying to diagnose Carol here.
But do you not get the sense that like the obsession and fear of like physical toxicity was more prevalent back in this era?
Absolutely. And I think it comes in waves. I mean, I think it's come back. I think during COVID it came back, right? I mean,
well, but that's like a viral.
No, but I mean, regarding like vaccines and stuff, right? Like, I'm putting that toxin in my body.
People were like scared about like acid rain versus like the overarching boogeyman of like climate change.
That's true. But I mean, and also think about like Chernobyl, right? Like literal nuclear, like wind blowing nuclear waste all over Europe. 3 Mile Island, just before I was born. My parents visited 3 Mile Island like a week before that happened, and I've always wondered, like, was I somehow warped by this? was before the disaster, mind you, and no, I was not warped by it, but got to create our comic book myth for ourselves somehow. Yeah, some of the themes that come up, she learns about like deep ecology. She falls asleep on the couch that she hates, right? The wrong couch is delivered. She has to go back to reorder the right couch. It's a whole crisis for her. She's a housewife, but she has literally outsourced all of the domestic work to the servant, who's like in a maid's uniform. This is also like the last era, I think, in American history when you would find people who had maids wearing uniforms in their house. I don't think that survived the 90s. Like in the 80s.
No, I mean, I had family who had. But like, I guess they were really quite old at that point. So
but were they in a uniform? So they were like holdovers.
Oh yeah.
But wore a uniform.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But in the 90s. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the 2000s.
Really?
I think so.
Because like my grandmother, when I was growing up, she was quite wealthy, and she had a butler and a maid, and they were usually a married couple, and they would they'd rotate out. A new one. It wasn't like she had the same one for, but eventually at some point in the 2000s that stopped. Like she didn't or if she had someone helping her, they were no longer like wearing a uniform. Like something about it changed. Something about the character.
You don't think there'll be a character like Jeffrey from Fresh Prince ever again?
Alas, I think his days may be numbered. Now, at least not in the United States. Certainly, there are domestic servants, of course, but I think it has a different character. But I don't know. Maybe if you go to the Jeff Bezos compound or whatever, there's a bunch of uniformed
maybe
servants. I don't know. But
let's talk about how things sort of fall apart for her.
Well, in a way, she sort of reminds me a little bit of the mad woman in the attic trope from Victorian and Romantic literature, of just like a woman who's driven insane, but isn't actually insane, is just seen to be insane because of the patriarchal world around her that is utterly unable to cope with her having any agency, right? Mm-hmm. So she starts to get sick. One of the early instances is the thing we talked about where she's driving behind a car. She starts coughing. She has to pull into a garage. She's careening through the garage. It's very nightmarish. She begins a fruit diet with her friend.
Love the fruit diet.
Well, the friend's brother dies of AIDS, but they can't even name it. And many people have mentioned that this film is very much, like, AIDS is very much, it's not a direct allegory for AIDS, but like, the way that AIDS was ignored and utterly shunted to the side because of its association with primarily gay men in the 80s is clearly on the filmmaker. I mean, Todd Haynes is a gay man from that era, right? Like, clearly he's thinking about that and using Carol and the way her position as a woman has led her manifesting of this unexplained illness that in some ways resembles AIDS. Like, she starts to manifest unexplained rashes and things like that, right? Well,
and just the general sense that her entire immune system is being degraded and deteriorating.
But she has that scene with the friend early on, and she's like, my brother died. And Carol's like, was it? And she's like, no. I mean, people always thought so, just because, he was like 35 and single, and then he got sick really. So it's like, okay, so what? like I mean, like, we're meant to understand that just everyone's in denial about AIDS, and that something similar. So they start this fruit diet. She starts getting sick. She starts not performing her few roles in her relationship with her husband. Yeah. She
becomes very, very like empty looking.
And she doesn't want to have sex anymore. And like the husband is so annoyed by this. And so like she gets a perm. She has a nosebleed. She's horrified. She's crying. She's like, oh my God. She comes home.
They tell her to stop the fruit diet.
Well, before that, though, she goes...
He's like, yeah, I could have told you that. The fruit diet.
Yeah. Also, the one thing that she likes...
You need protein.
Yeah, you need protein, says this, like, 80-year-old doctor who's just a complete dick, right? And she tells Greg, her husband sees her. I think Greg, the actor who plays Greg, is also John Connor's foster dad in Terminator 2.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He's like, I like what they did with your hair. Looks sexy.
Well, what about the dinner scene with the friends?
Well, I'm talking about that next, but like he's clearly just implying it's time for bed, and she's like getting in bed and starting to read. It's like age-old symbol of not interested in that tonight, honey.
It doesn't even seem to occur to her anymore. It's like almost like she's not even aware that she's rejecting him.
Right. And he's a petulant child about it. Right. He like kicks rocks and is like, when are you going to get better? Like, when am I going to have that sex in a week? Or whatever, it's like, yo, bro, are you like 12? Like, what are you doing? Then she goes on this partner dinner or this dinner with one of his clients. And this guy is telling this incredibly crass joke about a vibrator being stuck in a woman. And everyone else laughs, and Carol's just kind of zoning out. She's like,
but it's such a funny example of the what I love so much about the tone of the movie, where all of the people laughing are laughing because it's what they're supposed to do.
Exactly.
But they're also not comfortable.
It's a socially conditioned response that they're just going to endure this.
She just won't do it anymore.
Well, she won't. She's passed out. She's like literally like asleep, sitting up all but. Yeah, it's the doctors are like, well, everything's
right. What I mean to say is it's not a real protest against the crassness of the joke. She's beyond that.
Right.
She's falling to pieces.
Yeah, she's totally disengaged. The doctor is like, you're perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with you. She goes to an allergist. The one thing in her life, she doesn't drink, she doesn't smoke. The one thing she likes in life is milk. She goes to the allergist. And
also of the era.
Yeah,
milk was so big.
This is even before the Got Milk campaign.
But still, milk was king.
Oh, yeah. The Dairy Council had ads running all the time. Yeah. Hankering for a hunk of cheese. Oh, yeah.
I drank so much milk in the late 80s and early 90s.
Gross. No, me too.
Now that I think about it, I just would take glasses of milk.
That's horrible.
Drink the whole thing, just milk.
Yeah, it's not good. I don't like it.
I mean, it was great at the time.
I mean, it's fine, but it's not something.
I mean, you put a cookie in it, it all makes sense.
Sure,
one cookie and milk makes sense.
Sure,
but alone, yeah.
So she goes to the doctor. The doctor's like, get off this fruit diet. Also, she's like, I'm just a total milkaholic.
I'm just a total milkaholic.
And he's like, stay off the dairy, cut it out. Yeah. It's very hard for you to digest. So it's like the one thing in life she likes is taken away from her. The allergist later, she is doing one of those tests. Do you ever have that done? Go to the allergist. They like prick you with all the possible things. I did it when I was, 12, 13, something like that. And let me tell you, Michael, I was allergic to absolutely everything.
Really?
Everything under the sun. I've gotten over 99% of my allergies. But when I was a teenager, adolescent, I was allergic to every plant, every animal, every... And
Interesting.
I used to just sneeze. Yeah, I got over it.
I don't think I had any allergy ever.
You know how I got over it? I told myself that I'm
not allergic.
This will come back later.
I've heard that's usually a cure for that.
Well, that's what Peter Dunning, who we'll meet in a little bit, advises.
Right.
One thing before we get into that is Rory. So the son is so good. He is such a monster.
How old is he?
I think the actor was about 14 when the movie was made. 13.
The character's like 10. Right?
I think the character's probably like 11 or 12. Yeah, something like that. He's old enough to be forthright and annoying and in a way that a younger
also
child...
doing one hell of a social studies paper.
Oh my God. So he reads this paper, and I've transcribed...
Out of nowhere in the movie.
We just cut to them sitting at dinner, and Rory's reading his social studies paper, which is... In the 80s, there are more and more gangs in the Los Angeles basin, plus more stabbings and shootings by AK-47s, Uzis, and MAC-10s, killing numerous of innocent people.
Love that line.
LA was the gang capital of America. Rapes, riots, shooting innocent people, slashing throats, arms and legs being dissected were all common sights in the black ghettos of LA. Today, black and Chicano gangs are coming into in the valley and mostly white areas more and more. That's why gangs in LA are a big American issue by Rory White. And the dad's response
Dad goes, good job, Rory. It's so nuts.
And Carol's like, why does it have to be so gory? And
right. Makes no comment on like the insane content of the actual thing, but doesn't get down with the
dissecting people.
Yeah,
like
the imagery bothers her.
And then Rory, every time Carol says
present racism,
every time she says anything to Rory, he just pushes back so rudely and so hard. He's like, gory. That's how it really is.
Yeah.
And he is such a monster. It's a really brilliant acting performance. And just that speech is so funny. Like when I show this in class, I just start cracking up. And the students are like, our professor is deranged. Like, why is he laughing at this? And I'm laughing because it's just so on point. It's just another way of showing how her opinion has no value to these people at all.
Yeah.
What she thinks doesn't matter. And that the dad is so out of touch with his own son that he doesn't understand he's raising a freaking serial killer who's just like talking about like gangs dissect. What is it? The gangs with Dr. Frankenstein is in the gang? I was like, what are they talking about? Anyway.
Right. Just like classic white fright bullshit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, that's the other subtext, right? So she eventually goes to see a psychiatrist because the doctor's like, you're out of my hands.
Got to take this up a notch. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the
cutting the dairy didn't do it, huh?
Yeah. And the bias and sort of pathologizing of psychiatry of the era, where it's like, if you thought, when I grew up, certainly I thought if you went to a psychiatrist, there was like probably an 80% chance of you getting taken out of there in a straitjacket directly, right? Like we all had this one flew over the cuckoo's nest.
One flew over the cuckoo's nest, like really was
poison perspective on mental health care, which.
Right. But it also has the moment still in there that's like, It's very similar to the first season of Mad Men, where the psychiatrist is talking to Don Draper about Betty's condition, and this is again like late '80s, early '90s, and it's like when the doctor refers him to a psychiatrist, it's like, here's the business card that you need to call to give her the psychiatrist, so that you can be on top of things.
Yeah. No, it's so good. This is around the time she discovers the fumes flyer that we talked about earlier, right?
Are you allergic to the 20th century?
So good. And the psychiatrist is of no help at all. She has another breakdown when she's at this baby shower where she's sitting on a chair with a little girl, the daughter of one of her friends, sitting on her lap. And the camera just zooms in as she starts to like shake and almost have a seizure. And the little girl who's sitting on her lap, her face, she becomes so concerned and horrified until eventually she just runs off to her mom. It's like, Mom. It's unbelievable. Like, and the friends, again, are vaguely sympathetic, but are like, I heard she's seen a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
Things are going downhill for Carol. Right. And again, everyone in her life is completely distant from her. She starts going to these therapy meetings.
It's almost as though, like with the friends, like we'll talk about the party in a second, right? But like it's almost as though they don't have the capacity for compassion anymore, and not necessarily out of a sense of evil, but more indifference about their own lives and the overall sort of like decline and deterioration of community that's been replaced by
the superficiality.
That's right. Which ran rampant. If you were around back then, like this really does feel like of that time.
Absolutely.
Where the sort of superfice was being like punctured, but not dealt with, if that makes sense, right? Like people start thinking about this type of thing, obviously long ago.
Yeah.
With like whatever casserole parties and stuff like that. But
sure.
This era had a weird desperation of like corporatization and sort of the decline of the community.
Absolutely. So the party's another bad downturn in her psychological health. She starts going to these group therapies meetings about environmental illness that she learned about from the flyer. Mm-hmm. The speaker, which is actually just a TV playing a video to everyone, says certain people's natural tolerance to everyday substances are breaking down. And as this is happening, there's this like Doom, Blade Runner, like Terminator synth soundtrack that's kind of very at odds with the visuals, but not at all, but totally in keeping with the feeling of dread and like we're moving towards the end of the world, right? Like this isn't an obvious film from the end of the world perspective, but I think it's very fitting for the topics we cover, right? I mean, this is about like the breakdown of something essential about human community, and as manifested in the life of Carol,
and feeling that the end of the feeling that your natural state is safe.
Yep.
Right.
No, exactly.
Just by virtue of living on Earth, you are breathing in something that is killing you.
Exactly. And then she tells Greg she went to this thing, and he said, "Who told you to go to this?" Which is, again, it's like, you can have decided to go to this on your own. You are incapable of action. She starts getting into tapes that are just insane about this. They have a kind of new age, almost Scientology-like lingo. You need to create an oasis in which to live in order to get clear, to reduce your load, right?
Yes.
She starts like this jargon starts like coming in.
And then the mask.
What? She starts wearing a mask. She starts carrying an oxygen tank everywhere. She moves into a closet in their house, which is just, there's like aluminum flooring, like that stuff you put over people on a ski slope. Like that's covering all the ground. And there's it's like an oxygen tent, or she has like, and she's listening to these tapes. She goes to get the laundry and they're fumigating. at the dry cleaner. And she walks in, and the owner comes in, oh, hello, sorry, we're spraying. And Carol has just collapsed. She's seizing out.
Pesticides. Also a great example of what I was talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Like, DDT, right? Poison.
We're obsessed. Yeah. We're obsessed.
She's in the hospital. Again, there's nothing wrong with her, but she sees an ad on late night TV for the Renwood Center by this guru, Peter Dunning. And Peter Dunning is played by Peter Friedman, who played Frank
in Succession.
Yeah, and is so good as this kind of...
way less face weight.
Yeah, well, I mean...
I didn't recognize him at first because he was so thin.
Right, this was, 30 years before...
No shade. I'm just saying, you think you're going to recognize the guy's face right away. You're going to be like, that's like half of his face.
Yeah, and Carol decides that this is the place she has to go. So she moves to Renwood, which is somewhere in like... Sedona, or like it's somewhere in like Arizona. I feel like it could be Joshua Tree or whatever, but it's far enough.
I'm pretty sure
it's far enough away. She had to fly there, right? So Peter is very charismatic. He's very kind of like jokey and funny, but his philosophy is also quite sinister, right? He seems to blame people entirely for their illness. That the ultimate cause of your sickness is always
your immune system is failing. It's your fault.
Right. And he claims to have AIDS, but I don't know how seriously we should take this. One of the other people's like, oh, Peter is a chemically sensitive person with AIDS, so his perspective is incredibly vast. Which it's like, okay. There's also the hippie stuff, right? After he gives his opening speech, they read this mantra about being safe. And everything is right with our world, right? And then these women come out, and this woman comes out and sings like this, oh, kind friends all gathered round. And it's like this, Puff the Magic Dragon-esque, like Peter, Paul, and Mary kind of energy. Yes. And another thing, Peter in his speech is like, oh, the world's getting better. Like, I see the decline in drugs and promiscuity. And it's like, wait a minute, what does promiscuity have to do with environmental illness? Well, nothing. But as we spend time at Renwood, which is the last half of the movie, really, we very quickly realize this is a cult, right? I mean, it's a new age cult. They're not, I mean, you're paying for it, so it's a little different, but most cults you're paying for it, right? He also says, the transformation in the world is the same as the transformation I revel at within. And he's always drawing this weird line between internal and external that feels tenuous at best. Like, I feel good, therefore the world is good. It's like, well, it doesn't work like that. Like,
it does not work like that. And
Carol initially doesn't seem to be getting it. We see her in the crowd looking totally stone-faced and bewildered. And the director...
Yeah, at first it's almost like, has she been scared straight? Like, did she almost realize she's gone too far?
Is she going to leave, right? But no. And Greg, her husband, has not joined her. Like, he's too busy with being a bigwig or whatever.
Yeah.
He's like, once I get off this deadline, Rory and I'll come to visit. We see their visit, and we'll talk about that in a minute. When she's alone at night, she sings this Kenny Loggins song, as it's almost like she's trying to hold on to the world that she's left behind, right? But she seems to be forgetting the words. Like, it's almost as though we're seeing her, like, her attachments to the world be broken down. One by one. We've already seen her social life collapse. We've seen her relationship with Greg and Rory collapse. Not that it was great to begin with. The director, Claire, is sympathetic, says, oh, I was like you when I came, and the thing I would do is I'd stand in front of a mirror every night and tell myself that I love myself. I'd say I love you to myself, which seems very dark. So eventually she's writing to Greg and Rory. I think things are getting better. Oh, but there's new fumes that are coming to my cabin. And it's like she's hundreds of meters away from any source of fumes.
Might have to move to a different cabin.
Yeah. She sees Lester, who's this guy who's just kind of
looking worse and worse all the time.
She's also looking terrible, right? She's getting more emaciated. She starts to develop a rash on her forehead.
Right. She's still on an oxygen tank.
Yeah.
But she's young.
she's like 27 or something. She's not old at all. Lester is this long-term resident who wears this almost like a gimp suit. It's very weird. I did a drawing of Lester for the cover image of this episode, as I was required to by law. And Peter says, she's like, "Oh, who's Lester?" He's like wearing this sweater and he has a mask on and he's got gloves and he's just kind of like almost like a zombie creeping around the edges of the campus. Peter says, "Oh, Lester's just very, very afraid to eat, afraid to breathe. But let's talk about you." It's almost like Lester's like a prophecy of where Carol's headed, right? I mean, she's going to be Lester in a year if she stays at this place. And he says the point of Renwood is what we're about is trying to absorb as many of these tensions as we can. So you're free to do the kind of healing you need to be doing. And it's like, well, isn't her problem partly because of the tensions? Like, if you just absorb them, aren't you just isolating her? Like, this idea that you can heal when all your worries are put away. It's like, well, then what happens when the worries come back, right? Yeah. I mean, it seems like a fundamental flaw. She signs up for kitchen duty with this creepy guy, Chris, who wears rugby shirts all the time. Although he appears to be about Carol's age, he seems like her to be in a kind of state of arrested development, a sort of overgrown child. And he clearly likes her. He's like, "Oh, we can like do a meal together." Eventually Greg comes and it's kind of he seems bewildered by the whole place. He sits in on a speech by Peter where Peter declares that he has stopped watching the news. Like, the negativity, if I believe the negativity of the news, my immune system will also believe it. And Greg and Rory are sitting there and they're just like, what the F is this guy talking about? I don't know. Did you have any thoughts about the ending of the movie? Like, we're getting close.
I love the ending of the movie. I mean, I think that the part that I lost me a little bit was kind of the from signing up for the kitchen duty through to the end. I thought the very ending was really good, which you should talk about. But like, I think that the only negative thing I would say about the movie is that I felt like it ran out of a bit of steam down the stretch.
Okay. I disagree because I feel like it's really important to show. So there's a great scene when Rory and Greg are there, and Greg's like, "Oh, what's that fancy house up on the hill?" She's like, "Oh, that's Peter's house." And we see that Peter lives in this like palatial mansion akin to the place where she came from, up above the concrete Renwood Center. And it's kind of like, oh, I see how this works. And originally he'd left that out of the movie, and then he did test screening where they put it back in. And like, audiences needed that because without that, they weren't sure about Peter. They were like, no, maybe he's really well intentioned. But like, when you see that he's living in this huge mansion, you're like, oh, this is a scam. Like, because his whole thing is like, illness is always caused by, we talked about this before, self-punishment. Like, you've done this to yourself. And the thing with Chris is a little bit confusing because they have this dinner that they make together. And Chris is like telling these horrible jokes about like just awful punning jokes. And Carol's like, "Ha ha ha, oh, good one, Chris." And in a weird way, she seems more at home with him, even though he's
right.
awful.
But
she looks so much worse. Yeah. Chris also surprises everyone and is like, "It's Carol's birthday tomorrow. Let's," and they sing for "She's a Jolly Good Fellow." Very odd. And Carol starts to give this speech about all she's learned at Renwood. Yeah. And it's just an incoherent mess. She just falls apart. And Peter...
From this part on, I like it a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Chris relationship is important just because it suggests the downward spiral. Like, from now on, Greg is awful, but he's at least rich and has This guy is like a fellow Renwood patient who's like a mess. We don't even know what's wrong with him. And he's like manifestly unattractive and wearing these horrible rugby shirts. I don't know why I have it in for rugby shirts so much, but something about the way he looks just really triggers me. And it's like these are her prospects now, like socially, right? And like, how is this going to be the solution to her ever going back to the world that she's left? And I think the strong implication is that she never will, right?
No.
That she's on a downward spiral to be a Lester, because she's moved into this igloo. And just before he leaves, Greg moves her in. It's not literally an igloo, but it's like a dome structure where she can be completely cut off from the environment. She doesn't make any sense. She gives this speech. Chris walks her back to the igloo, and it's almost like he expects to be invited in or something. It's this very awkward, weird moment. And she's like, good night. He's like, okay, good night. And then the final scene of the movie is just her looking herself in the mirror saying, I love you, in this like broken, half-hearted way. And then the movie just cuts to black and that's it.
Yeah.
And some people are disappointed by this ending, but for me, this ending is perfect.
The ending's so good. Yeah.
It's perfect, right? I mean, the contrast between where she starts in this huge mansion that's beautiful but completely sterile to this like metal igloo in the desert that is also completely sterile. Right. It's like perfect. It's like everything's changed, but in a certain sense, nothing's changed. I mean, she goes from looking great to looking terrible, but none of these changes she's attempted to make have addressed her.
Yeah. At the end of the day, she's in a room alone.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where she is the entire movie. And I think the movie is so good because, again, it doesn't answer the question, is this psychosomatic? Is this environmental? Is it a little of both? It doesn't matter. The point is that as environmental conditions worsen, there are going to be innumerable psychological conditions that arise.
Well, I think that too, like it hits me primarily as a great period piece.
Yeah.
Because it, I think back to that era, which, to extend it a little further out into the time that he was making it, into the mid 90s.
Sure.
Like, you started to see a shift, I think, in, again, not just the decline of community, but this increasing fear of the world.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I don't think it is romantic to suggest that the way that parents, for example, had their kids running around after school in the late 80s, early 90s, definitely 10 to 15 years later was not the case, and certainly is not the case now.
Yeah.
Right. Where like I will go back to where I grew up, which was not similar from a class perspective, right? Sure. But very similar from the like cookie cutter subdivisions, and everybody like has their home, and then they like go to the block party and
they have the backyard,
they have Jello, and they go back to their house. And every now and then you find out that like one of your friends' parents got divorced, and your parents are shocked because nothing real was ever really being discussed with anybody,
Yeah.
But like I go back to that neighborhood now, like my hometown, like where I grew up, and I'll like drive around in the afternoon, like 3, 4, 5 o'clock, and like it's empty of children.
There's no kids playing.
There's nothing going on.
No kids playing stickball in the streets.
Well, street hockey would be
okay. Canada, of course, my mistake.
But yeah, I think that is what.
Not even kids skateboarding or anything.
I'm like left with the movie is that like people don't. It's like every era that like every decade or whatever generation that moves forward, it's like reacting against the shittiness of life and then being like, oh wow, it's even worse now. Yeah. But like really, it's just the exact same intensity of a reaction. So like, we're not freaking out about pesticides anymore. We're freaking out now about like climate change. But like the intensity is the same. Like people were losing their shit about, again, like white fright and all this stuff. Like it just seems like not even cyclical. It's just like whatever the lightning rods are, right? They are met with the same intensity, and everything felt like it's been falling apart. Basically, it feels like for the entire modern era.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. And I think, there's the false hope of the internet. Well, the internet's gonna fix all this. It's gonna allow us to connect in new ways.
Sure.
And then now we have, AI is gonna fix all this.
Right.
It's gonna do the work that we don't have to do the work anymore.
I don't know if you had the experience, but I was growing up a little later than this time, right? But certainly by the mid 90s, we're like a common thing I think for people would be like, you would hear of or see like parents melt down every now and then.
Oh yeah.
Like most communities had like the story of like the workaholic like lawyer dad who absolutely snapped one time, at a party or something, some sort of community event, and somebody who's just like living this nightmarish suburban life just loses it, and everybody else just sort of like goes about their day. But like there was this sense of underneath, we were all taking part in sort of this suburban emptiness,
like a charade almost.
And then movies like this started like poking at that thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
To the point where like, I don't think there's any romanticization of suburban life anymore. Is that fair? Like, it doesn't feel like it to me.
No. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, even when I was a kid living in Maryland in the late 80s, I would ride my bike all up and down our street, and I would just go to a friend's house. And I'd be like, is my friend here?
Walk up.
And they'd be like, no, he's at a dentist appointment. Come back later. It's like, okay, goodbye.
Right. Well, my fiance is like a nanny, and like these kids, they all just like, at least at the time, they would sit on group chats.
Yeah.
Like group FaceTimes from the time they like got home to like when they finally had to do their homework or whatever, or after that, you know?
Yeah.
That was how they would like commute.
Socialize. Yeah.
And again, it's not like whatever. I'm not like,
part of it's COVID and stuff too, but yeah.
Again, it's not like, everything was better. I mean, in fact, I'm not saying that. It's like everything feels like a different version of
the same bad. Yeah.
And it just has moved in this direction now, where like the standard is to interact like virtually, right?
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Well, this is a great movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. It's on YouTube. You can find it. Just Google Todd Haynes Safe 1995. It should come up. And I'm really glad we got to discuss it. I think we got some good points here. Next week, we're going to be visiting an old friend in a little bit more depth. That's right. We're finally digging into some of the thinking, some of the philosophies of Robert Kennedy Jr., the new Secretary of Health and Human Services.
One of America's great and perhaps last geniuses.
And that's going to be fun. Until then, if you like to, you can follow us on Instagram at The End of the World WMS. And you can also like or rate and review the show on the podcatcher of your choice. And please follow us, subscribe, tell a friend about the show. We're always...
tell two friends.
Tell 2 friends, tell 3 friends. We're always searching for new listeners as we continue on our slow quest to actually be podcasting as the end of the world occurs, which is unfortunately seeming more and more likely with each passing day.
That's right.
But we're back for RFK Jr. next week. And until then, this has been The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu. And we'll talk to you real soon.